Brain Slayers. Today's video is asking the question, why do we get fat? And leptin's role in obesity. The history of obesity research and treatment is fascinating, as it is unfortunate. It was once widely accepted that obesity was at least partially a hormone problem. In 1932, Dr. Wilhelm Falta, a prominent internist in Vienna, noted that for fattening, it's necessary to have an intact pancreas. And what he meant by that is that the hormones from the pancreas. However, in the mid 1900s, there was a dramatic shift in thinking that settled on our current prevailing dogma, the calories in, calories out perspective that holds obesity is simply a matter of ingesting more calories than expended. In other words, the theory goes if we eat more than we burn, we'll gain fat. We can only lose fat if we eat less than we burn. This makes a certain amount of sense considering we define body fat as a biological caloric reservoir, a place to store calories for later use. Further, it fits our understanding of energy use and storage. If you throw less wood fuel on the fire, there's less to burn. Unfortunately, this theory ignores the complex processes in the body that regulate how it uses fuel. The body is a little more complicated than a campfire. Ultimately, hormones determine what the body does with the fuel we eat and store, whether it's making more muscles, making bigger bones, making more fat, dissipating it as heat, and so on. There are thousands of known hormones, with more being discovered all the time. While most have nothing to do with how we use calories, many do. And no single hormone promotes fat cells to grow as much as insulin does. But what about leptin? So, leptin, from the Greek word thin, meaning, or leptos, was once considered the great solution to obesity, the obesity epidemic. For very few people with an inability to produce leptin, it is. However, for the vast majority of people who struggle with their weight, it is not a solution. In fact, most obese people have elevated leptin levels. So yeah, it's kind of crazy to think about. However, leptin is no longer as effective in obese people as it once was in regulating appetite and metabolic processes. One key process is leptin's inability or inhibition of insulin. Leptin is supposed to prevent insulin secretion, which will allow and help a person to be thin. However, too much leptin for too long, the body becomes leptin resistant, and leptin is progressively less able to prevent insulin secretion of all, which leads to fat gain. Unfortunately, this is a vicious cycle. If leptin resistance stems from chronically elevated insulin of or elevated levels of leptin, then what increases leptin in the first place? Insulin, of course. Insulin naturally stimulates leptin production from fat tissue, so too much insulin leads to too much leptin. The starkest example of how insulin drives body fat are the two typical types of diabetes. Remember that type 1 diabetes is a disease of too little insulin, and type 2 diabetes is a disease of too much insulin. In the case of type 1 diabetes patients, unless they take their insulin injections, they cannot get fat. Not even a little bit. In fact, some people with type 1 diabetes are so terribly aware of this fact that they're so determined to stay thin that they intentionally underdose insulin in order to avoid gaining fat, regardless of the amount or type of food they consume. This is an eating disorder called diabulimia. That's a funny name. So, type 1 diabetes often manifests in the second decade of a person's life. when the person, as a teenager, is more mindful of body image than ever. Unfortunately, despite being as lean as he or she wants, the person experiences massive hyperglycemia. Glucose levels can be up to 10 times higher than normal. While we focused on the negatives of too much insulin, too much glucose is certainly also problematic. Many people with chronic diabulimia endure kidney failure, blindness, and even limb amputation. Furthermore, independent of glucose, too little or no insulin results in dangerous changes to the blood pH, causing potentially lethal acidosis. In contrast to type 1 diabetes patients, staying lean without insulin, those with type 2 diabetes have been prescribed insulin to control blood sugar will gain weight. The aim for these patients is finding the insulin regime that results in the least amount of fat gain. Once type 2 diabetes patients start to notice weight gain, some may attempt to correct the problem by eating less. However, as the insulin injections are making their bodies ever more insulin resistant, they will need ever more insulin to control blood glucose. And even eating less won't be sufficient to prevent the insulin induced fat gain. The bottom line is, when it comes to fat, the hormone insulin is the critical factor. If insulin is up, body fat goes up. If insulin is down, body fat goes down. Indeed, insulin is so good at increasing body fat that rising amounts of insulin increase body fat even when the number of calories consumed stays the exact same. To make this point clear, if person A is eating 2,500 calorie diet that keeps insulin low, person A will be leaner than person B, who's eating a 2,500 calorie diet that keeps insulin high. We'll look at this diet in more detail in a later video. Simply put, insulin directs nutrients towards being stored as fat. Of course, as we'll see later, it is true that obesity leads to insulin resistance, but it's important to understand that it also works the other way around, and that insulin resistance leads to obesity. This alternative paradigm is more than semantics. It represents a fundamental shift in how we view the relationship between obesity and insulin resistance. It would alter how we view the origins of insulin resistance and give us a better understanding of how to fight it. In fact, we've reached that point. Having positioned insulin as the main villain for practically all disease, it's time for the origin story. How did such a nice, normal process like insulin signaling go so terribly wrong? So that's what we're going to start digging into. This concludes part one of why we get sick. The next series that I'm going to cover is part two that explores, how everything got started and the origins of insulin resistance. That's what I've got for you guys today. Don't forget to like and subscribe because it really helps the channel out. And remember, guys, that together, you and I will slay the dreaded diabetes dragon.